At 0206 hours, the radar picture lied. A clean, confident blip blooming out of empty water, as if the Persian Gulf had just invented a ship that did not exist. The night was thick and wet, the sky a low blanket of broken cloud that swallowed starlight and turned the horizon into a smudged line. A northwest wind at 16 knots chopped the surface into short, sharp crests. Humidity clung to everything: skin, metal, optics, and the air smelled of salt and diesel exhaust from distant merchant hulls creeping along the traffic lanes. Visibility above the water was 5 nautical miles on the best bearings and half that toward the Iranian coast, where coastal haze and light pollution blurred the shoreline into a dim orange bruise. Then the ghost target appeared, and every watchstander in the screen felt the same instinctive chill. If the picture is wrong, the next 60 seconds can kill you. I'm your host at World Defense, where we break down the operations shaping global security. And what happened next wasn't just another electronic warfare scare. It was a wake-up call for any fleet that believes a modern Navy can still fight by sight and radar alone. The US Navy formation that night was built like a moving fortress. The carrier USS Abraham Lincoln held the center of the strike group outside the most crowded coastal waters. Her flight deck darkened between launches, her escorts spread in layered arcs. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers ran the forward screen, one to the northeast and one to the northwest, steady at 18 knots with disciplined spacing. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser held slightly aft, its SPY radar and command systems acting as the group's air defense brain. Overhead, an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye fed the composite picture through data links designed to make sure no single ship ever had to fight blind. Under the surface, a US attack submarine held a quiet patrol line to deny Iran the underwater layer. Iran had chosen this night to test the one lever it believed could level the playing field without firing a shot: the electromagnetic spectrum. The aggressor was Iran, operating from the Persian Gulf littoral with a distributed electronic attack plan built around shore-based jamming sites and mobile emitters. The visible pieces were easy to spot on satellite days earlier: antenna farms, generator houses, hardened shelters, and trucks hidden under netting. The invisible piece was the technique: coordinated noise and deception designed to corrupt the very sensor fusion that made a carrier strike group dangerous. At 0205 hours and 31 seconds, the first jamming pulse hit. It didn't sound like anything on deck. It didn't look like anything to the naked eye. It arrived as a subtle but immediate distortion in the electronic warfare consoles. A bloom of energy in specific bands, a rise in background noise, and then the worst thing you can see in a combat system: a track that appears perfect, stable, and wrong. Surface contact, bearing 061, range 34 nautical miles, speed 24 knots, tracking inbound. Cues from other sensors: a ghost. Iran's cues from other sensors: a ghost. Iran's plan depended on what that ghost would do to American decision-making. If a false target could pull a destroyer off station, if it could trigger a radar mode change, if it could force a protective maneuver by the carrier, it could open seams in the escort geometry. And once seams exist, the next escalation becomes possible. Fast attack craft harassment, missile launch windows, a submarine probe, a drone swarm. You don't need to win the fight in the first move. You just need to make the other side lose its shape. The Iranian electronic warfare cell ashore understood this. They were not amateurs. They had studied American doctrine. They knew US ships live and die on track integrity. So they pushed 2 effects at once: deny and deceive. Deny meant noise. Broad energy meant to smear radar returns and reduce detection range. Deceive meant precision. Crafted signals meant to create believable tracks where nothing existed. At 0206 hours and 08 seconds, the deception got bolder. The ghost target turned 15 degrees and accelerated to 28 knots, as if it had detected the US screen and was adjusting course for an intercept. The false track moved with the confidence of a skilled helmsman. It was designed to provoke. On the Iranian side, there was satisfaction. Operators in a hardened coastal site watched their own screens bloom with the simulated target and listened to report fragments from a mobile emitter team positioned on a headland. Their command node had one goal: caused the Americans to commit to a false picture long enough for Iran to demonstrate it could seize the narrative of the night. But there was one problem Iran could not fully solve. The US Navy does not trust a single sensor. It trusts agreement. At 02:06 hours and 41 seconds, the forward destroyer's Combat Information Center called for cross-queuing, ESM checks, infrared confirmation, data link correlation, surface search comparisons. The ghost track had no electronic emissions associated with it, no engine heat pattern, no wake line on infrared, no corroboration from the second destroyer's radar in a separate geometry. The ghost was starting to look like exactly what it was. And that is when Iran tried to force the issue. At 02:07 hours, the jamming power increased. The noise floor rose sharply. The sector toward the Iranian coast became grainy and unstable on multiple displays. Merchant contacts flickered. Some returns broke and reacquired. The electromagnetic environment began to feel like a storm, and storms are where mistakes live. What they didn't know was that the US Navy had already been tracking the aggressor for 48 hours using surveillance assets. 2 days earlier, satellite imagery had flagged unusual activity at 7 coastal electronic warfare and air defense support sites. Generators staged, antenna arrays reoriented, maintenance crews moving in patterns consistent with activation drills. A P-8 Poseidon operating from outside the densest coastal coverage had mapped electronic emissions during brief test windows and built a library of signatures, frequency behavior, pulse repetition patterns, and timing discipline. Signals intelligence teams had correlated those patterns with known Iranian electronic warfare units. The strike group had been warned before the first jamming pulse ever touched the sea. So when the noise floor rose at 02:07, it did not create panic. It confirmed a file. At 02:07 hours and 22 seconds, the strike group executed its pivot, the quiet shift from being jammed to hunting the jammer. On the US ships, the AN/SLQ-32 electronic warfare suites moved from passive monitoring to active threat management. Threat libraries updated, bearings refined, specific emitter identification tightened. The group stopped trying to see through the jamming with brute radar power and instead began to treat the jamming itself as a beacon, because jammers radiate, and radiators can be targeted. At 02:08 hours and 03 seconds, the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye adjusted its orbit and pushed a refined electromagnetic picture to the screen. The false surface track was demoted. The jamming source bearings were elevated. The carrier's air wing began turning the response key. At 02:08 hours and 41 seconds, 2 EA-18G Growlers launched from USS Abraham Lincoln, climbing into the humid dark with their engines roaring and their electronic warfare pods ready. Their mission was not to bomb ships. It was to bend the electromagnetic fight back into American control. The Growlers carried tactical jamming systems capable of attacking hostile emitters, and they brought something even more important than power: specialized crew and tactics designed to make enemy jammers regret turning on. At 02:09 hours and 14 seconds, the first Growler checked in. At 02:13 hours and 44 seconds, the first Iranian coastal battery attempted to lock toward the sea. The US ship saw the behavior shift instantly through ESM. The destroyer commander issued a single cold directive: all stations, maintain missile defense posture. Expect inbound within 5 minutes. The crew did not flinch. They had been here in training 1,000 times. Now it was real. At 02:14 hours and 19 seconds, a suspected Iranian anti-ship missile radar began a tighter pattern. The US Surface Action Group responded with electronic countermeasures and decoy readiness, but the coastal radar's behavior didn't mature into a launch. Not yet. Iran was still trying to decide if it wanted to climb further up the escalation ladder while Tomahawks were already inbound. At 02:16 hours and 02 seconds, the first Tomahawk reached the Iranian coast. The impact was not a single Hollywood fireball. It was precision violence, a strike into an antenna farm. A detonation that tore through transmitters, cables, and power systems, a bloom of flame, a collapse of metal. then darkness where there had been radiating energy. 7 seconds later, a second impact hit another site, then another, then two nearly simultaneous, separated by less than 9 seconds. By 02:16 hours and 41 seconds, 5 of the 7 targeted locations had suffered confirmed hits. The remaining 2 were still radiating, barely, as if clinging to the last possible moment of defiance. At 0217 hours, the moment the title promised arrived. 17 minutes after the ghost target appeared, 7 sites went dark. Not metaphorically, electronically. The noise floor dropped. The coastal sector on American displays cleared. Merchant tracks stabilized. The false target evaporated entirely, as if it had never existed. The sea became readable again, and in combat, readable is survivable. On the Iranian side, the emotional shift was brutal. Operators who had been confident at 0206 were now staring at blank screens and dead consoles. Backup generators tried to kick on and failed. Antenna arrays lay twisted. Powerhouses burned. Communications between sites fractured into isolated bursts. The closure of their electromagnetic attack had not been gradual. It had been amputated. Iran attempted one last retaliatory act. At 0217 hours and 33 seconds, a coastal launcher site not included in the initial 7 target set fired a single anti-ship missile toward the sea in a desperate attempt to prove Iran could still strike. The launch plume was visible on infrared. The trajectory was immediately tracked by the destroyer's radars and the Hawkeye's broader picture. The U.S. defense sequence engaged with the same discipline it had shown all night. At 0217 hours and 46 seconds, the missile was declared inbound. At 0217 hours and 58 seconds, an ESSM interceptor launched from an Arleigh Burke destroyer, climbing hard and then bending toward the threat with speed and guidance designed for exactly this moment. At 0218 hours and 09 seconds, the intercept occurred 11.4 nautical miles from the formation. A flash, a scatter of fragments, a second of silence. The missile died before it could force close-in defenses to speak. Phalanx never fired, RAM never launched. The layered system had worked. At 0218 hours and 41 seconds, an MH-60R Seahawk confirmed no fast attack craft surge from the shoreline in the immediate aftermath. Small boat activity spiked briefly, then halted as Iranian commanders tried to understand whether the United States would expand the strike set beyond 7 sites. The US did not chase further that night. Not because it couldn't, because it didn't need to. The objective had been achieved. Remove the jamming architecture that had attempted to blind the fleet, restore sensor integrity, and reassert control of the electromagnetic domain in the Persian Gulf. World Defense, this is Raven 1. On station in 8 mics. Request updated emitter bearings. The escort commander responded with calm precision. Raven 1, multiple coastal emitters active. Primary bearing 058 to 072. Range estimates 40 to 65 nautical miles. 7 distinct sites assessed. Stand by for target packets. Iran's operators ashore began to sense the shift. Their deception track had failed to create the desired chaos. The Americans were not chasing ghosts. They were triangulating the source, so Iran escalated again, trying to drown the air in noise and force the US to back off from the coast. At 0210 hours, the jamming spread into additional bands. The goal was to degrade data link stability and widen uncertainty. For a few seconds, some track updates arrived late. Some fused returns lagged. The sea picture became less crisp, but it never collapsed. The US system architecture was built for contested spectrum. Data links were redundant. Sensors overlapped. The strike group did not lose awareness. It shifted which nodes mattered. At 0210 hours and 37 seconds, the first Growler entered the threat sector and began electronic attack runs against the strongest coastal emitters. It did not silence them instantly. It didn't have to. It only had to disrupt them long enough for the strike that mattered most, the strike against the sites themselves. At 0211 hours, the US commander made the decision that ended the experiment. Remove the sources, 7 sights, 1 sequence, no second chances. At 0 to 11 hours and 19 seconds, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser pushed strike authorization through the net. At 0 to 11 hours and 42 seconds, the first Arleigh Burke destroyer began opening Tomahawk launch cells. The missiles were not fired in anger. They were fired in control. Tomahawk cruise missiles are precision weapons designed to strike targets from extreme range, and the latest variants can be updated in flight. The message was simple. If you light up the spectrum from shore and threaten a U.S. fleet, the shoreline is not a sanctuary. At 0 to 12 hours and 03 seconds, the first Tomahawk launched. A hard white plume. A brief flash against cloud. Then nothing as the missile dipped low and ran out over black water. 3 seconds later, a second launch, then a third, then a fourth. In 28 seconds, a ripple of missiles left multiple ships, staggered to arrive on 7 separate aim points within a narrow window. The strike was designed not just to destroy, but to overload Iranian recovery. Simultaneous impacts that would collapse coordination and make replacement impossible in the moment. At 0 to 212 hours and 41 seconds, the second destroyer joined the sequence and launched additional Tomahawks to ensure redundancy. Missiles crossed the sea at low altitude. Guided by inertial navigation and terrain reference, invisible to most eyes and difficult to stop without a fully integrated and alert air defense network. Iran's coastal commanders realized too late what had happened. Their jammers were not forcing an American retreat. They were inviting an American strike. At 0 to 13 hours, Iranian air defense units attempted to posture. Search radars shifted, communications spiked. But the Growlers were already shaping the corridor, attacking key frequencies, forcing delay, forcing confusion. The goal was not permanent suppression. It was temporary paralysis at exactly the moment the missiles needed it. On the American ships, the defense posture never relaxed. Jamming can be a prelude to anti-ship missile launches, so the escorts stayed ready. Phalanx CIWS mounts were spun up in tracking. RIM-116 rolling airframe missiles were indexed for close-in defense. ESSM launchers were prepared for medium-range intercept if needed. MH-60R Seahawks moved to armed patrol stations with sensors wide, ready to prosecute fast craft or pop-up threats with precision. The outcome was clean. Iran's deception attempt failed. Their coastal jamming network was neutralized within 17 minutes of the initial ghost track. One retaliatory missile launch was intercepted. The carrier strike group maintained formation, maintained awareness, and maintained dominance without exposing the carrier to unnecessary risk. And that is what overwhelming superiority looks like in modern naval power. Not just bigger ships, but a system that can be attacked in the spectrum and respond by turning the spectrum into targeting data, then turning targeting data into strikes, then returning to defense without losing shape. But the night did not end the moment the displays cleared. Because the most dangerous seconds after you break a jammer are the seconds when the enemy realizes their lever is gone and reaches for the only thing left: kinetic fire. At 0 to 18 hours and 52 seconds, the Hawkeye called a new development. Not a missile, but a surface surge. 4 fast contacts departed a coastal inlet and accelerated into the Gulf, riding low and throwing spray. Their speeds jumped from 22 knots to 34, then 41. They weren't headed for the carrier. They were headed for the nearest destroyer, the one they believed had just fired the shots that humiliated them. Surface contacts bearing 055, range 19 nautical miles, multiple speed 41 knots, tracking inbound. On the Iranian boats, the mood was no longer confident. It was angry. A commander with a headset pressed hard against his ear listened to coastal reports. Dead sights, lost comms, smoke on the ridgeline, and understood he had exactly one chance to restore face before the Americans widened the strike list. He ordered a rush, not because it made sense, but because doing nothing would be worse in Tehran. On the US side, the rush was treated as what it was: a late, emotional move by a force that had just lost its plan. At 0 to 19 hours and 11 seconds, the closest Arleigh Burke shifted to 24 knots and angled 4 degrees to port to keep the boats in a clean engagement sector. At 02:19 hours and 28 seconds, the second destroyer mirrored, creating a crossfire geometry that forced the attackers to choose between two lethal arcs instead of one. At 02:19 hours and 41 seconds, an MH-60R Seahawk, already airborne on a defensive station, dropped to a lower altitude and brought its multi-mode radar and FLIR onto the incoming wakes. The radio traffic stayed cold. Surface contact, designate hostile if they cross 12 miles. At 02:20 hours and 02 seconds, the Iranian boats crossed 12.0 nautical miles from the destroyer line. They did not answer hails. They did not slow. Their course angle suggested a classic split. 2 boats toward the north lane, 2 toward the south, hoping to overload one ship's fire discipline and create a seam for a closer pass. The US did not give them the seam. At 02:20 hours and 19 seconds, the Seahawk issued the first direct warning on maritime guard, amplified through the night. Iranian small craft, turn away now. You are approaching US warships. Alter course immediately. No reply. At 02:20 hours and 34 seconds, the destroyer followed with a second warning, harder and final. Iranian craft, stop your approach. Any further closing will be met with defensive fire. The boats kept coming. At 02:21 hours and 07 seconds, the Seahawk transitioned from warning to control. It did not fire wildly. It did not chase. It fired a precision burst into the water 120 meters ahead of the lead craft, walking the splashes across the surface like a ruler. The message landed. One boat broke hard to starboard, wake carving. The second hesitated and then followed. The third and fourth continued, stubborn or desperate. At 02:21 hours and 29 seconds, the lead destroyer executed the next step, disable. A controlled burst struck the closest craft's engine housing. The boat yawed violently and lost speed, dropping from 39 knots to 12 in 6 seconds. Its bow rose and fell in the chop as if the sea itself was punishing it. The second craft tried to cut behind it, using the crippled hull as cover. That didn't work against a navy that fights by geometry. At 02:21 hours and 51 seconds, the second destroyer fired a warning burst that stitched the water directly along the crossing line, then a second burst that clipped the trailing craft's propulsion. The boat's wake collapsed. Its sprint ended. The remaining 2 boats finally understood the truth. This was not a harassment window. It was a controlled battle space under American rules. They turned back toward the coast at 40 knots, but even retreat was watched, tracked, and timed. At 02:22 hours, the strike group sealed the aftermath. The Seahawk orbited over the disabled boats, ready to respond if weapons were raised. The destroyers held standoff with defensive systems still hot, Phalanx CIWS ready, RAM indexed, ESSM prepared. Under the surface, the US submarine maintained a quiet hold on the littoral lane, ready to prosecute any hostile craft that tried to exploit the chaos in the underwater layer. If an Iranian midget sub had attempted to slip out under the noise earlier, a Mark 54 torpedo would have been the answer. It never came to that. The lesson had already been delivered. On the Iranian coast, commanders were now dealing with a different kind of damage. Not the kind repaired with a wrench. The kind repaired with months of rebuilding, rewiring, retraining, and explaining why 7 electronic warfare sites had turned into black squares on a map within a quarter hour. At 02:23 hours and 18 seconds, US signals teams confirmed what their eyes already told them. The spectrum had been reclaimed. Coastal emissions were fragmented and weak. The clean, false track behavior had ceased. The electronic environment had reverted to normal maritime clutter. Honest chaos, not engineered deception. And that meant the fleet could breathe again. Not relax, breathe. At 02:24 hours, USS Abraham Lincoln resumed its planned flight cycle. One Growler remained on station to watch for re-illumination attempts. The second returned for fuel and quick-turn readiness. The Hawkeye held its orbit. The destroyers returned to screen geometry, lanes re-established, coverage overlapped. Iran had tried to blind the fleet. The fleet had used the blindness attempt as a targeting signal. Then it had proven the most important truth of modern naval warfare. The side that can fuse sensors, fight in the spectrum, and strike with precision at distance does not just win exchanges. It dictates whether exchanges happen at all. The lesson is ruthless. In 2026, jamming is not a magic shield. It is a flashlight in the dark. If you radiate, you can be found. If you can be found, you can be hit. And if your plan depends on creating a ghost picture to force hesitation, you are gambling that the other side does not have the sensors, the fusion, and the discipline to call your bluff. That night in the Persian Gulf, the US Navy called it in minutes. The ghost target vanished. The sights went dark, and every fleet watching learned the same thing. In modern sea warfare, the fight starts in the spectrum, but it ends wherever the network that controls the spectrum can reach.